There are certain movies which gain a reputation over the years for being pretty intense in ways that people can definitely appreciate regardless of whether you are strictly speaking a horror fan or a gore fan in general, and those movies sometimes even get critical acclaim because of it. The Silence of the Lambs, for instance, is a perfect example because the movie has disturbing imagery and disturbing content, but it's not there for the sake of it. It serves the plot, it serves the story, and so, as I said, people who aren't even necessarily horror fans can really enjoy a film like that because it's just good. And the gore, the taboo content is really incidental. It serves the purpose. Then, on the other hand, you have movies which go straight in just almost for the sake of being taboo or gory or go for the shock value. Now that tends to be the way that people think of movies like Saw, for instance, especially from Saw 2 onward. Personally, I don't agree with that. I can understand why people think that they are gore porn or gore-nos, but that's not the case. It really isn't. If you compare the gore in a lot of Saw films, they're actually not as gory as people think. There is gore in there, but there's only really a couple of moments in the grand scheme of things, and the movies do really try to have a very clever overarching plot, whereas 9 times out of 10 it doesn't really come off as being that clever, but they are trying at the very least, and I do give them some credit for that, a small amount of credit. Then you have movies which the story even, or the characters, seem totally incidental. This is kind of one of those. Now, I am a fan of Eli Roth's work. I love Clown. It's one of my favourite horror movies, although he didn't actually direct it, but he got the ball rolling. He produced the film. So I am a fan of him. I think he's great in Inglourious Basterds as well. It's an excellent film. I'm a huge fan of Tarantino's movies. He might even be my favourite director. So I enjoy that bubble of the subgenres that those guys work in. It's cool to see Eli Roth on cam and behind the cam as well. I think Cabin Fever, for instance, was decent enough. Not one of my favourites, but I enjoyed it for what it was. Haven't seen the newer version. This one is probably his most notorious film, at least from what I've seen and heard, and it was a movie which, like some others that I've purchased, more often than not that I still haven't watched yet, is a movie which I didn't really buy expecting to enjoy it that much. It's just such a notorious film that I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Now, some of these movies I have already watched, such as this one, but compared to some others, which are also notorious, movies like a Serbian film, Martyrs, both the original and the newer version, Frontiers, I believe, is another one. A number of movies like that, Green Inferno, I believe to a lesser degree, and if I remember correctly, I think Eli Roth was involved in that as well. But movies like that, they have a certain reputation for being basically just shock value for the sake of it. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, it's kind of a fandom in its own right. But as much as I love a good bit of gore, and I really love dark content and content that's shocking, I can appreciate that totally. Some of my favourite movies have that kind of content in, but still I find myself more often than not enjoying these movies as much as I'd like to, because at the end of the day, going back to the Silence of the Lambs example, these movies feel like they spent so much time just trying to be shocking that they forgot to have a good film behind the shock value. Now, in the case of Hostel, it has a very well-known reputation. In fact, of those taboo films, it's probably one of the best known. And the reason why it's one of the best known is because it's no way near as intense as people think it is, in a similar way to Saw. Now, the end of the movie has some intense stuff. From, say, the middle onward, if you want to be more specific. The start of the film is basically just an excuse for gratuitous nudity all over the place, so if you're into that, certainly you could enjoy it. For me personally, of course, I'm not going to complain about a good-looking woman or women on screen, but at the same time, it takes me out of the moment when things like that happen in a film. Not just sex, but nudity in general. Not that it's disturbing or awkward, it's just not what I'm there for. I want a good bit of gore. Nudity just doesn't have a place there for me, and it just ruins the flow of the film, at least as far as I'm concerned. That probably sounds weird, but that's just the way it is for me. I'm not there for that at the end of the day. But the second half of the film in particular does definitely offer some moments which will not necessarily totally satiate a gore fan, but there's certainly some iconic scenes in there, some well-known ones. A certain Achilles moment, let's put it that way, which is very well-known. But in general, I found this movie to be, let's say, a little bit overrated, but not in terms of how good or bad it is, but how intense it is. The only kind of people who would find this to be an intense film are people who haven't seen that many horror films, because the violence in this movie, the gore in it, really isn't that intense. It's more the scenario which is intense rather than the actual stuff taking place in it. Because the essential plot of Hostel, without spoiling anything that you can't see very early on in the film, is it revolves around a couple of travellers from, I believe, the States. I think all three of the guys are from the States, who have gone to Europe to sightsee and do all of the associated stuff that you'd expect to do when you're in certain parts of Europe. And that's basically the way the first half of the film goes. But then each of the main three guys gets not necessarily picked off, but kind of separated from the group, if you will. And then it comes down to one guy in particular, the same actor who played El Diablo in Suicide Squad, incidentally, who it's cool to see him pop up here and there. He's not really a leading guy, usually, but in this one he kind of is. And it was cool to see him in that role. He's the best part of the film, for sure. But even then, he's not given all that much to work with because, of course, in a similar way to Saw, the movie isn't really about any one person, it's more about the spectacle involved and the shock value associated. Now, with all of that being said, can I recommend this movie? Well, we'll get more into the individual values that I'm going to give the film in just a second, but overall I would say that Hostel has some value. It's not a bad film, I wouldn't say, not at all, not even close in fact, but it's a movie which kind of feels like it doesn't 100% go to what it's trying to be. Now I know Eli Roth loves his gore, which is kind of why it's surprising to me that he didn't go much further. Now maybe there are alternate versions of the movie which I haven't seen. I believe I watched a director's cut or an unrated cut or whatever it is. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm remembering that wrong, but whatever version I watched didn't seem as intense as people pay off as being. But then again, they do that with Saw as well. So what then about our individual scores? And then, of course, I'll sum up at the end my overall thoughts. Well, first of all, as always, we have the story and the plot. And of course, in a movie like this, the story and the plot is really just a means to an end. You could say that that's always the case with a story or plot, but in some movies you can really notice it a lot more, and in this one that's definitely the case. The story is paper thin, there's not much to it, and it's not trying to be, so I can't score it badly in that regard, not that I'd want to, because it doesn't need to be scored badly. It does what it needs to do to get the job that it's trying to do done. So overall, I'm going to give it a 5, because for me, 5 is default. Every movie should get a 5 in every way, or better. Anything lower than a 5 is a bad score. So I'm actually basically saying that this movie is what it needed to be. As far as the characters, the motivations, the casting, I'm going to give it another 5, because although, as I mentioned, the main guy in particular is interesting enough, they're not really great characters, so it wouldn't be fair to movies with quite simply better characters to rate them higher. The girls, in particular the first half of the movie, are again interesting enough, but to be honest, and let's be honest about it, they're just there to be looked at, rather than to say anything profound. So again, it's not given them much service in the movie, and so again it wouldn't be fair to score the film higher because of that. As far as the visuals, the special effects, of course makeup, gore, which is always going to be the kind of field which you would hope a movie like this does well in, well, I am going to redeem it a little bit there with a higher score. In fact, the highest score of all 5 categories, with a 7. I am giving it a 7 out of 10, because although there isn't as much gore as you're probably wanting there to be, or expecting there to be, there is some. And as I said earlier, there are some memorable moments involving ankles and eyes in particular, and if you've seen the movie, you know the scenes that I'm referencing. There's also some more general stuff, like people doing crazy stuff in the background, especially towards the end of the film, or crazy, disturbed people doing things to other people, which aren't really lingered on, but they're there. Most of them, though, I can't remember. I remember that they happened, but I don't remember exactly what happened, and that kind of tells you all you need to know. If a gore fan can't even remember what happened, well, maybe the gore could have been better. But the gore which is shown is memorable. The 2 in particular that I mentioned are good, and they're not necessarily ones which I've seen in a huge amount of horror films. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, of course, music, sound effects in general, again I'm going to give it a default 5. Because I didn't find the score or the soundtrack overly memorable. It wasn't bad, but it's not amazingly good, at least for me. And the sound effects, if I remember correctly, are sometimes a little bit over the top as far as squelching and crunching noises, especially again toward the end of the film. But nothing to write home about, let's put it that way. Not bad, but not necessarily great either. Again, like with the story, it does what it needs to do. As far as finally the rewatchability and the entertainment factor, well, we're going to keep the streak alive with another 5. And the reason why I'm giving it a 5 is because I've watched this movie once or twice. I don't plan on watching it again unless I'm showing it to someone else, and there are quite a few movies like that for me. That doesn't mean that I dislike them, it just means that the movie didn't hit me enough to need to watch it a number of times. For some people, I think you'll probably really like Hostel. And I think Hostel is the kind of movie where, and I don't say this to be insulting to anyone in particular, but I think Hostel might be the kind of film that people who want to give the impression of being a cool, hip horror fan will say, oh yeah, I love Hostel. It's that kind of film where it's actually not as intense as they'd like people to believe, and passing it off as being as intense as they want it to be requires that the person they're talking to hasn't seen it, if you know what I mean. Because if you actually have seen it, you're probably going to think, okay, this person likes Hostel. They say it's their favourite movie, maybe. That pretty much tells you everything you need to know about that person's horror proclivities, if you will. They like gore, they want to come across as being cool, but maybe they haven't seen movies which really are intense, way more so than Hostel is trying to be. Because at least in part, Hostel does feel that without being camp, I didn't find the movie to be camp at all, which is great. And as I mentioned earlier with the casting and the actors, they're not bad. None of them are. They are all passable at the very least, and some of them are interesting. But overall, the movie feels like it didn't really go, as I mentioned earlier, all the way. It didn't totally decide what it wanted to be. It didn't go ultra taboo and ultra gory. Some things aren't shown on screen which you'd think, well, in this kind of movie, more than any other, you are justified in showing utterly disgusting things. So why didn't you? If there's ever a place to do that, it's here. And the movie clearly isn't about holding back and letting you think about it for yourself, because if it were, it wouldn't show the things that it did. So it's kind of in a little bit of a no man's land for me. It's not quite intense enough to be worthy of its reputation, but at the same time, it's certainly intense enough to probably unsettle the average horror fan. So a little bit of a middle ground, I would say. It's certainly not a bad film, but it's not one of my favourites either. And that is reflected very much so in my score of 5. I enjoyed watching it, it was enjoyable enough, I'm glad I did watch it to know why people talk about it, but at the same time, now that I have watched it, I don't know why people talk about it so much. It's kind of one of those movies, and it's difficult to explain for me because, well, I've done so as best as I can overall, and if you want to check out the movie, it's not a waste of time doing so. If it sounds like it appeals to you, if you like your gore, if you like horror, if you like more, say, entrapment or kidnapping and gorno or torture porn or just torture movies in general, then check it out. Just don't expect it to absolutely blow your mind. It's an interesting, slightly tongue-in-cheek approach at doing this kind of thing. It's no way near as intense as it could have been were, for instance, it a French film. If this were a French movie, the same story, same characters, but directed by a French person, it would have been way more disturbing and way more intense. Or if it were directed as a Korean movie, it would have been way more intense and way darker and way more disturbing. Even using the same content, you could remake this movie with all of the same story beats, but make it far more disturbing. Because the potential is there, but because it has that American kind of slant on it, and this isn't a knock against Eli Roth, that's just the way American movies are, it feels a little bit too slick. And that doesn't really suit this genre. Overall though, I'm giving it a 2.7 out of 5, which is not a bad score by any means. That is above fresh, as it were, for me, above average. So, as I mentioned, If it appeals to you, I'd recommend checking it out at least once, and it's not a waste of time. If you decide you don't like it afterwards, then at least you haven't wasted a massive amount of time. It's not all that long a film, so yeah, sure, check it out if it sounds like it appeals to you. Just don't expect it to live up to the hype which pop culture gives it. Overall then, that's it for this particular review, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.